Welcome everybody. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's great to have you here today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Laura. Laura Rickard did her bachelor's degree at Brown in environmental studies, which is a kind of place I think she's still at very much. Did her master's and PhD in communication at Cornell, where she completed her PhD in 2012. Spent 3 years at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in the Department of Environmental Studies, and came here in 2015 and joined this big thing that, how many people are connected to SEANET that are in the room right now? Yeah, so I have a story for SEANET people that you might or might not know. It's a $20 million grant, a really big deal, an amazing team, and it built directly on a previous $20 million grant, the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, which led to the creation of the Mitchell Center. And so I remember when I first came here a long time ago, 10 years ago, one of the first people I went and met with was Paul Anderson, who was the head of Sea Grant, to ask him advice about how to do kind of stakeholder-engaged, solutions-driven interdisciplinary research. And eventually, Paul became the director of the SEANET grant, and here's what he had to say when somebody asked him, well, what's the connection between SEANET and the Sustainability Solutions Initiative? He said, SEANET project builds on what SSI has done. We'll be using similar approaches to sustainability science to study how Maine's $120 million aquaculture industry can grow in ways that are socially acceptable and don't harm the environment. So we feel like it's been really exciting for us. We've got one set of things going, and we continue to work on other sustainability projects, including our current one on the future dams. But it's been fun to also watch SEANET take off, and so today's a great day for us to hear more about where that research is going. And so in Laura's case, with expertise in risk communication, science communication, communication theory, I've been really fascinated to watch them, to kind of learn about the mix of research methods that Laura uses, both qualitative and quantitative social research, social psychological methods, things like survey research that does structured equation modeling and path analysis, but using grounded theory to do in-depth interviews, media discourse analysis. I think she's up over 20 plus peer-reviewed papers by now, which is pretty amazing. And just kind of 2 papers, one of her most recent and one I read quite a few years ago. One of the most recent the title is Sizing Up a Superstorm, Exploring the Role of Recalled Experience in Attribution of Responsibility and Judgments of Future Hurricane Risk, and that is published in Risk Analysis, I think, last month. But also, I read another really fascinating one back maybe in 2011 or so. Title is In Backyards, on Front Lawns, Examining Informal Risk Communication and Communicators, where, among other things, she was out talking to people who apply pesticides in your yard to try to see how they look at this, and using a lot of qualitative methods for that. So really wonderful blend of approaches and kind of using theory to guide all of this. So it's a pleasure to have you here today, Laura. Welcome.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you, David, so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me today. Am I speaking into the microphone? You can hear me all right? So I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my ongoing research. I'm going to be talking mostly about, fully about SEANET work. And so these are some projects that are really just getting off the ground, so I'm excited to hear some of your input moving forward. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge some people who've contributed a great deal to this research. First, Drs. Caroline Noblet and Keith Evans, right here at UMaine in the School of Economics. They played a fundamental role in the national survey data that I'll be talking about today, and they're part of the SEANET team. I'll talk about SEANET for those of you who aren't in the know in just a few minutes. Andrea Philposh-Parker is a former colleague of mine from SUNY ESF, and she helped me with the news media content analysis that I'll discuss. And finally, my excellent team, my PhD student Kevin Duffy, who's in the audience, and our crew of fearless undergrad RAs who have helped us quite a bit, again, with various stages of the news media content analysis that I'll talk about. Okay, so I've chosen to organize today's talk with a few broad questions, but I just want to step back for a minute and say perhaps the larger question that really motivates my research and what I'm talking about today is how can we use communication theory to move research forward towards solutions-oriented approaches to aquaculture. So this might mean, for example, figuring out how do we frame strategic communication messages to garner support for aquaculture policy, knowing that not everyone is favorably disposed in all parts of the state to aquaculture, and we'll talk about that more later today. Or how can we consider issues like trust that come into play when we're talking about managing natural resource issues. So first, I'll briefly describe just the current status of aquaculture development in the U.S., and in particular, I'll talk about what are some risk communication challenges that go along with kind of the history of aquaculture. I'll then talk a little bit about how we might be able to apply communication theory to understand and maybe even solve some of these challenges. Third, I'll introduce two studies that I'm currently working on to show you kind of how we apply that theory to empirical work. And finally, moving forward, I'll talk about what are some of the implications for strategic communication and also what's some future research that both I'm already doing, but we might do more of in the future. So to begin with, let's talk a little bit about aquaculture in the U.S. and some of those risk communication challenges. So for those of you not in the know, and believe me, before I came to this job, I did not know very much about aquaculture, and I'm certainly no expert now, but I'm learning more every day. Very generally speaking, aquaculture is defined as breeding, rearing, or harvesting animals or plants in water environments. So that's sort of the most simple definition. The techniques used can vary across the board. You can be raising mussels on ropes in saltwater environments. You can be raising trout in a tank 200 miles from the ocean. In Maine, we talk a lot about marine aquaculture, which is specifically occurring in saltwater environments. And here in this state, we have things like kelp and other sea vegetables, mussels, and of course our salmon industry, which is very well known. So more than 50% of the seafood that's produced globally for human consumption comes from aquaculture, and that percentage is rising. So people who are advocates of aquaculture, who think this is something we should do more of, both in the US and just in general, point to many of the benefits of this technology. So we can reduce pressure on wild fisheries. We can promote efficient production, especially as we move towards these sustainable techniques. It takes fewer resources to produce affordable protein. It creates jobs, especially in communities that might be economically depressed. And it's not just jobs in raising the fish or raising the sea vegetables, but processing and marketing and all these related industries. But the interesting part is in this country, we don't actually do much aquaculture. Aquaculture in this country supplies just about 5 to 7% of our total demand for seafood. And aquaculture in this state is very important, and it's not new. So aquaculture's been around in Maine for several decades. We've had various types of aquaculture, beginning probably with shellfish and finfish aquaculture. And it's been important in a lot of our economically depressed part of the states, like Washington County and so forth, and still is. But what is new is this recent push to use these evidence-based, sustainable, basically evidence from research to guide practices in aquaculture. And so this is where SEANET comes in. So back in 2014, UMaine received this $20 million, as David Hart said, EPSCoR Track 1 grant to study sustainable ecological aquaculture in the state. And so this is an incredibly large group of researchers. We're divided, we're not just on the UMaine Orono campus, we're on various places across the state. And we're divided up, broadly speaking, into these 4 themes. These are the themes that are guiding the research that we do. Theme 1 generally looks at the current status of aquaculture development in Maine. So they're doing things like deploying buoys across various waters in the state and figuring out, what is actually going on in the environment here and how might this be affecting both the aquaculture that's already happening, but, aquaculture we might be wanting to do in the future. Theme 2 is looking at how this situation might change. So we've got climate change, we've got rising ocean temperatures, more the the pH changing in water. How is this going to affect aquaculture development? Theme 3 is looking at potential innovations and opportunities in aquaculture. So just, not all of them are working on this, but to give you an example, we have some, food scientists thinking about things like, if you put kelp into a granola bar, are people going to actually buy it? Is that a product, a value-added product that would be something we could market? And we do in this state. So in theme 4, we're the social scientists of the bunch. And we think about, basically, if you take into account the current status of aquaculture, how it might change in the future, and all of these innovations and opportunities, how do we use all that information to improve decision-making related to aquaculture? And we think about individual users, like somebody who might be a coastal recreationalist in the state. How might he or she be affected by kayaking into a, oyster farm, for instance? But we also scale it up and think about whole governance systems. What's going on in Augusta? What do we have to think about in localities when it comes to managing aquaculture? So our work in theme 4, the human dimensions theme, we think of as inherently cross-cutting. We're trying to integrate this biophysical research into what we're doing as social scientists. So here's our fearless team. We're an interdisciplinary group. We consist of behavioral scientists, anthropologists, geographers, economic and marine resource economists. Some of the grad students are in the room with us today. And as the communication person on the team, I think I bring the unique perspective of studying the communication element of this. What are some of the attributes of aquaculture that might cause people to perceive it in a particular way, and how might this influence how we could or should communicate about it? And so I want to tell you a little bit about what some of these attributes of aquaculture are. So I called this risk communication perils, and I'm playing this up because these are not necessarily perils, but these are potential problems. So first, aquaculture in general has had somewhat of a mixed legacy, but on I guess the negative side, in many cases, finfish aquaculture has gotten this reputation of being associated with very high-profile environmental and human health risk-related events. This was a 2004 Science article that received a lot of publicity, and it was essentially saying there are these high levels of contaminants in farmed salmon. Similarly, this is just the cover of, this is actually a publication in Scotland, and this was just a few weeks ago, and you can see that cover story. Oops, sorry.
The top one, I think, is the one that...
Oh, here it is, thanks. So, revealed scandal of 45 Scottish lochs trashed by pollution. This was a cover story about salmon farms in Scotland and the effluent that was being generated by the farms. So these incidents tend to be amplified by media attention, sustained media attention, when they may be more isolated incidents. So this is one element we have to think about in the general communication sphere. The second thing, and I'll talk a lot about this today, but generally speaking, there's a pretty low level of knowledge when it comes to the issue of aquaculture. Just people not really knowing what you're talking about, not knowing, does it only happen here in these pristine areas with lighthouses? Is it only in Maine? Can it happen in Iowa? What are the various types of aquaculture? So one is low level of knowledge. The other is the issue of relevance or salience. This, of course, to people who live in Maine or who may have an affinity towards coastal areas, we look at an image like this and are immediately struck by it and have some sort of meanings. For others in the U.S. who don't live in coastal areas or who don't visit these areas, not the same. May not be as motivated to learn about things like marine aquaculture, may not care as much. Okay, so how do we communicate about the issue with people for whom it's really not relevant? And the final thing, I'm not sure if you guys can read this, but this cartoon is called Fishing for GM Salmon. That's the new genetically modified growth hormone salmon approved by the FDA. If you can ever catch one, we'll eat for a month. So essentially, aquaculture is often confounded with other risks that have been kind of marked in public opinion or in other ways as being inherently dreaded, being unnatural, one of them being genetic modification. And so in the last year, the FDA has approved the first genetically modified salmon for human consumption. So this is an issue because we know that in this country, at least, GM foods have a sort of mark to them. Many people are very opposed to them. Not everyone, many people. And so now we're associating aquaculture with that. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we know in communication theory and how it speaks to some of these issues I just brought up. So research in risk communication suggests that when we know less about something, so let's say aquaculture, we place more emphasis on the role of trust for determining what's a risk and what's a benefit. So in other words, we look towards the actors that actually are responsible for controlling that risk, for managing that risk. However, we also know that when it comes to thinking about acceptance or perception of a particular new technology, knowledge often is not very important at all. The case in point is recent work done in the context of climate change and climate change risk perceptions. Many studies have found that values, things like your political ideology, what you see as the role of government, what the role of government should be, are much more predictive of whether you think something like climate change is a risk than whether you're scientifically literate or know facts about, carbon sequestration. So it's sort of a mixed bag. We know that perhaps trust is more important than knowledge, and maybe values matter too. Research in risk communication also tells us that whether we perceive something as risky or not depends a lot on the attributes of the risk. And by that I mean things like, is the risk perceived to be voluntary or not? Is it something that's under our control? Can we choose whether to be exposed to it? Is it something that's known to science, or is it something that is new and just came on the scene? So all of these things matter when we're judging risks. And it's not just non-experts. Experts can, have the same sorts of judgments. The other thing that becomes really important is something called affect. And affect can drive our risk perceptions. So Slovik refers to affect as the faint whisper of emotion. It's this heuristic that we often rely on to tell us our gut judgment, something's inherently good or bad. So we might not have all the information, but I can feel like aquaculture is a bad thing. It seems wrong. And that becomes really important. We know that perceived benefit and risk are often inversely related. And what I mean is if we perceive something to be very beneficial, we also tend to perceive it to be not very risky, and vice versa. In reality, risks and benefits are often very equivalent. We live in a complicated world, and there are lots of benefits to certain technologies and also lots of risks. But this is where our perceptions tend to go. We also know that mass media portrayal of risk and benefit is very important to driving public opinion. I'll step back for a second because communication scholars would cringe at that. Don't understand that as saying that what the newspapers say is what people think. What the newspapers say tells us a lot about the salience of an issue. So the famous quotation in what's called agenda setting is, the news media tell us not what to think, but what to think about. So in other words, they tell us aquaculture is a topic that we should pay attention to, but not, you should be scared of aquaculture. But it's still really important to think about it. Recent studies have suggested that news media portrayal of aquaculture varies. So it's not the same if you go to Germany or the US, or I think they've done a little bit in the UK. And we also see some regional variation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in this presentation. So the final area I want to talk about is trust. And communication theory has confirmed the truism. This is where I love social science research because it's sort of like confirming things that we all think, of course that's true. But there's research in risk communication to suggest, trust is really hard to gain. It's easy to lose. So it's got this asymmetric property. Some of the reasons why this is the case, there's many reasons, but some of the reasons are, for example, if you have, information about someone, let's say an aquaculture company, that's trust destroying, so sort of bad information, it tends to be judged as more credible than information that's trust enhancing. So maybe there was information that, oh, this aquaculture company, donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to an environmental cleanup fund. We might judge that as less important than, hearing information that they polluted or that they had some fish escape from their farm, for instance. We also know that trust is influenced by risk perception, but risk perception is influenced by trust. That's a bidirectional relationship. Another aspect of this is something called source credibility. So we can trust various actors, but we also need to think about information sources as being trustworthy or not. Source credibility is often measured by asking people things like, does this source tell the whole truth? Are they biased? Are they, up to date in what they're telling you, and so forth. These judgments are very much related to risk perceptions. And the final thing, again, maybe sort of a duh to some of us in the room, but various studies, all kinds of contexts have shown that trust in science can be really critical to accepting new technologies. So again, you can know nothing about it, you can even not find it very relevant, but if you trust in science, the process of science, scientists, you tend to be more supportive of that technology. So putting together those last few slides, one of the ways we can think about sort of, what do we do with all this kind of disparate theory? If we think about knowledge and awareness, risk-benefit perception, and social trust and credibility, we can think of those as kind of three bins that can all contribute to acceptance of new food technologies. And just to step back for a minute, the literature that we can look at in this area often refers to things like genetically modified foods, because we have a long history, especially in this country, of trying to understand why people don't tend to accept GMOs. Aquaculture is not a new technology, really. I mean, it's been around for quite a long time. However, based on some of the things I told you in the beginning, we've got, it's conflated with some of these GM technologies, right? We can use GM, we can have GM salmon that's raised via aquaculture. Also, people tend to not know very much about it. It's a very low knowledge issue. So I'm kind of arguing that it can fall into this same category, and so some of this literature that is arguing these relationships can be applicable. Okay, so I want to move now into actually showing you how you might apply some of this theory, and I'll talk briefly about two studies. And so here are some really broad research questions. I don't want you to get kind of mired in the details, because the idea here is not really to think about the particulars, but to think more broadly. So just generally speaking, the first research question, to what degree do U.S. consumers are they aware of, or do they know about aquaculture? Second, to what extent do they perceive benefits and risks of aquaculture? And a sub-question of that is, if we looked at news media, how might the news media present benefit and risk information? Whom or what do U.S. consumers trust? That's the third question to provide information, so that's a source credibility issue. And finally, if we take all of these variables and consider them as sort of predictors, do they relate to support for aquaculture in general? So I just want to emphasize as a disclaimer, this is very much work that's in progress, it's under construction, and so I'm going to present to you some really preliminary results, but a lot of the more sophisticated analysis will be done later. But feel free to ask questions about it. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about these methods. First, the news media content analysis, we looked at 4 regional and 4 national U.S. newspapers. They ranged from the Advocate in New Orleans to the Boston Globe and the Portland Press Herald. The idea was to look at publications that cover a range of types of aquaculture and parts of the country. We used LexisNexis, ProQuest, and the newspaper archives themselves. We had these search terms. We had a set 10-year period. We came up with almost 500 articles. And we had 3 trained independent coders, and the idea there is you want to make sure that you are coding the same thing if you have a team of more than one people. So we made sure to check for reliability on those variables. So when we were coding, we had a laundry list of things we were looking for. For the purposes of the presentation today, I'm just going to explain two of them. One of the things that we looked for, and this was a presence or absence situation, it wasn't any degree to which this was in the article, just is it here or is it not here? Environmental and human health risks, and this included things like, did the article mention environmental problems caused by aquaculture, problems related to food safety, or risks to aquaculture implementation or of aquaculture implementation. And the second category had to do with benefits. So did the article mention things like water quality is improved when we grow shellfish, or there are nutritional benefits of eating seafood? Okay, the second method that I'll talk about briefly is a national survey. This is a survey that we just finished fielding in January, and this was in cooperation with GFK, which is a national survey company. And the nice thing about working with them is that they can get you, they have a panel, basically, and they can reach these groups, for instance, like that don't have internet access, but you can still do an online survey, which is great. They also provide data weights, so that when you get your survey data back, you can apply those weights and be even more sure that you are approximating U.S. Census in your understanding. So we asked 40 questions, closed and open-ended, about 24-minute completion time on average. So we ended up with about a 1,200-person sample, roughly 50-50 male and female, mostly white, middle-aged. About almost 30% said they had a high school or GED as their highest degree. And about 35% of them said that they ate seafood approximately once a week. So this was something we looked at because obviously we wanted to know, we're asking you an entire survey about essentially seafood, and if you don't eat it, you may be different from the people who eat it all the time. So I want to talk a little bit more about who these people were in the national survey. So they were broken down by region pretty well, region of the U.S., but just to zone in there, for New England, that was only about 5% of our entire sample. So that's important to keep in mind because, one of the things that you might be thinking is, how does this apply to Maine? We're following up this national survey with a Maine-specific survey. So it's always hard to be able to generalize to a particular state if you have a small sample of people from the state or the region. But the nice thing about national data is it gives you that bird's eye view. Okay, so I want to move into the first research question, and that asked about the audience's knowledge and awareness. So the first thing we asked people on the survey was to indicate their current knowledge. So this is a subjective question. It's asking them to estimate that. And so what we found is the mean answer was just a little bit above, or almost 16, and this was a 0 to 100 scale. So 0 meant I know nothing, 100 is I know everything there is possibly to know. So we see that that's pretty low. Okay, and we're not completely surprised there. But then we asked them to estimate how much they think they need to know. And results were higher, so that's promising, suggesting that maybe people on average want to do a little bit of information seeking. However, it's certainly not at the limits, right? If we drill down a little further, something that's kind of interesting is we can find a significant difference by U.S. region. So if you compare the means of the people who live in each region, you see that the Northeast and the Southerners perceived that they knew more than the Midwesterners. Again, this is kind of interesting because it might sort of confirm what we would think. There's less aquaculture in general in the Midwest. But again, this is subjective knowledge, so we're not really sure if they actually know more or less. We also asked people to think about if they had heard about aquaculture in the last 10 years. So we asked them if they had heard about anything positive or anything negative. And so I want to direct your attention to the orange and the gray areas. Those are the know and don't know responses. So most people don't know. Most people either don't know or they haven't heard anything about aquaculture. And in both cases, less than 20% of the sample said they had heard anything. Right? So again, not surprising, but it's confirming that we have a very low information sample here. So the third way that we can think about measuring knowledge is with an actual set of objective questions. So in this case, we went to the NOAA Fisheries website, and we went to this page called 10 Myths About U.S. Marine Aquaculture. And we adapted these into a set of 6 items. So this is essentially like a mini quiz. However, we asked people to say a statement was true, false, or they didn't know. So they had the option to just say they didn't know. So the first thing I'll direct your attention to is this column here. This is the percentage of people who answered the question correctly. And so you can see it ranges from, about 5% all the way up to over 32%. But what I find more interesting is the don't know category. In each of these questions, you have about 60% of people saying that they simply don't know. So again, this is very good information for us to know, maybe not completely surprising, but just knowing that that baseline information is perhaps not there for people. So on average, we saw about 1 correct answer per person. And there was no significant difference by U.S. region. So looking at objective knowledge this time, no differences depending on where you lived. However, we did see a difference by level of seafood consumption, which I found kind of interesting. So if you never ate seafood, you knew less than people who ate it once a week or once a month. So again, this is kind of, I think, what we would expect. If you are a consumer of seafood, you're going to be more informed. But again, it's kind of nice to see that play out in our, at least, initial findings. So I'll move into the second research question, which looked at risk versus benefit perceptions. And on the survey, we asked people to tell us if they thought risks strongly outweighed the benefits of aquaculture or benefits strongly outweighed the risks. So they had this 1 through 5 scale to use. And we found that people were a little bit on the side of benefits outweighing the risks because on average they were answering above that midpoint or the mean. So this is kind of interesting. The other way we can measure risk and benefit perceptions is to use a series of statements in scales. So we had 2 different scales that did this. The first was a perception of aquaculture process risks. And so these items asked things like, they were statements that said things like, aquaculture has the same problems as some types of land-based agriculture. And on average, so we see the average there is a 3.54. Again, this is above the midpoint of the scale, and it's toward the agree side. So people are saying there's some risk involved in aquaculture. On the other hand, we have this other scale, perception of aquaculture product benefits. Again, multiple items measured on this scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. Items like aquaculture provides a healthy food source for people who can't afford wild-caught seafood. Mean answer is it's above the midpoint of the scale, so people are also agreeing that there are benefits. So interesting here because it seems to be, some indication that we see perceived risks and perceived benefits. So I want to move now into thinking about the news media coverage, because now we have a little bit of information about our survey population. So what did the news media tell us? So this figure is all of the articles we looked at, which were about 500, so this is over the whole 10-year period. And you can see here that over 50% of the articles covered risk in some way, and fewer covered benefit. Okay? I'm not going to be talking about these other themes, but just to tell you, we did look at things like, economic issues, scientific issues, which included things like research, political, and sustainability. But I'd be happy to address them in the questions at the end. So if you look overall, so again, this is the 10-year period. This is the number of articles here. If you look at the coverage of risk, and I apologize, I probably should have taken out these other ones for the purposes of this. Oops. But you can see risk is this light blue line, so it's this line right here. And we see that it kind of peaks early on, just around 2006, and it goes down and it has this other peak around 2007. It's also decreasing, and maybe another peak, but hard to say in the end here. On the other hand, benefit is this orange line. Benefit is much more flat, okay? Except until we come to about 2013, and then it seems to be increasing. And interestingly now, I can say that we've done some more analysis in the regional sample because we're doing this in Maine as well. And that same kind of trend of risk spiking and then basically decreasing and benefit flat and then increasing around 2011 to 2013 is about the same. So why is this the case? So we dug a little bit deeper into the actual articles and two quotations that I think kind of illustrate what's going on here. One is, this is an article, this top one is from a 2011 article in the Washington Post. And so you have this individual saying, essentially aquaculture has raised these environmental questions and kind of gives a laundry list of some of the risks. This was repeated quite often in the articles. So even if an article was talking, generally speaking, about benefits of aquaculture, there would be this kind of requisite statement that just laid out the laundry list of risks. On the other hand, we have this 2015 Boston Globe article that talks about Massachusetts oyster farmers producing a healthy, sustainable, ecologically beneficial, and local food product. Again, this was also something that we found quite frequently in this coverage, especially in the Northeast and after 2011 or 2013-ish. You know, figuring in these ideas of healthy, sustainable, and local food. So finally, when we compare the national to the regional, so the orange is the regional, the 4 regional newspapers, and the blue is the 4 national newspapers, we see that there are some significant differences. In particular, the national newspapers are more likely to cover benefit, and the regional, the national newspapers, as you can see, are more likely to cover both benefit and risk. But really what's interesting here is just that the regional newspapers are less likely to cover benefit, okay? So you're less likely to open the Boston Globe or the Advocate in New Orleans and read about, you know, why is aquaculture something that's good for us economically, environmentally, and so forth. We also saw this relationship with sustainability. So the stars indicate that there's a statistically significant relationship there. So again, significant associations were found between whether the article was in the national news or the regional news, and these 3 themes. Okay, so just moving into the final question here, I wanted to know about social trust. And in this case, we're just looking at source credibility. So remember, source credibility was, do we think that there are sources of information that can be trusted, that are accurate or inaccurate, they're fair, they tell the whole story? So what we did was we gave people this little statement to read, and we asked them about 3 sources. We asked them about government officials, university scientists, and aquaculture industry representatives. And what we found is that generally, on average, people trusted, and this is going to be misleading because the numbers are actually backwards given the scale we had, but people trusted university scientists the most, followed by industry and then government. So this is trust in these sources to provide information about aquaculture. So interestingly, most trust in university scientists, least in the government. And finally, we asked generally about trust in science. So things like science can raise our standard of living, and we had 10 items that looked at this. And on average, people are fairly trusting of science, so the mean above the midpoint there. Okay, so finally, how can we put this all together? All right, so I've given you some information about knowledge and awareness, risk and benefit, source credibility. How can that relate to support for aquaculture? So on the survey, we asked 7 items. Again, put them together into a scale. Some of the items were things like, I want to support policies that expand aquaculture operations in the U.S. People generally agreed. And this is what we found. And these are just really simple Pearson bivariate correlations. So they're just showing a relationship between 2 variables. We don't know anything about causation. We don't know anything about intervening variables or anything like that. But these are all in the direction we would expect. So this is saying, you know, the more you trust in science, the more you perceive a benefit of aquaculture, the more you perceive benefits outweighing risks, the more current knowledge you have, the more perceived needed knowledge you have, your actual knowledge, that's your quiz score. And if you see these sources as credible, so if all of those things, as those things go up, your support for aquaculture goes up as well. Again, simple correlations, but the fact that these are in the direction that we would expect is really promising, because it suggests that, if we do some more complicated analysis, it might be, what we would think. Okay, so finally, I want to end up with, what do we do with all this? I've kind of given you a laundry list of some really preliminary analysis, but what do we do? And how can we do some further research as well? So generally speaking, we see this low knowledge public. So people don't have a lot of information. Okay, and when I say people, I'm talking very generally about the US public, especially based on our survey data. However, I don't want to stop there. It's really important to suggest that there are some significant issue publics. So issue publics, a fancy way of saying that there can be these pockets of folks for whom aquaculture is really relevant and important. So we saw some regional variation, okay? Differences between how people thought, how much they thought they knew. Okay, that would be really important to follow up on. We also saw that people seem to endorse both the benefit and the risks of aquaculture. Okay? So perhaps antithetical to what we would expect. We would expect that if they saw benefits, they would see no risk. But we saw that there was perhaps perception of both going on. We also saw that the source credibility was judged the largest for university sources, and then less so for government and industry. The other thing that we saw that could be important to look into is this discourse in the mass media. Okay, generally speaking, there seems to be, at least to some extent, this reproduction of kind of like a trope about what an aquaculture risk is. Okay, and so as I showed you in that 2011 article from the Washington Post, just this repetition of, there are risks with, genetic material escaping and mixing. There's risks with effluent and so forth. But this is possibly changing, especially in New England, with some of that discourse about sustainable aquaculture and shellfish aquaculture. Okay, so with that, I want to tell you just briefly about some promises that I see for risk communication. Okay, I see at least 3 of these that we could work on in the coming months. The first, of course, related to what I just said, is to really focus on this idea of talking about aquaculture in relation to this narrative about local food and about sustainable food, and kind of capitalizing on this foodie culture. This is already being done. So this was a 2014 article advertising shellfish in Maine, but it seems like this could be done more strategically and also thought about in sort of a more controlled way. The other thing to think about is we have this low knowledge in many parts of the US, and it also looks like trust in science is really critical. I didn't have time to talk about my focus group results today, but focus group results suggest that university sources and Sea Grant in particular are very trusted to provide aquaculture information. This is all great information for us on SEANET because it suggests we should sort of keep doing what we're doing, that this is a source that is trusted to provide information. And finally, a major area to think about is more particular framing of how we talk about risk and benefits when it comes to aquaculture narratives. Part of the survey that I didn't get to talk about was a controlled experiment in which we randomly assigned people to see a news article. This was a mock-up news article, not an actual news article, where we varied whether it discussed Washington or Shanghai, and then we discussed whether we framed aquaculture as something that, what do we lose by not adopting aquaculture? What do we gain by adopting aquaculture? And then we talked about various benefits. It's lucrative, it provides jobs, and so forth. We haven't analyzed these results yet, but this will be interesting to know if this geographic location framing is going to influence support for aquaculture, and also if the gain versus loss benefit framing matters. Okay, so finally, next steps. Really what we'd like to do in the future is to further analyze the national survey data. As I said, I showed you very simple correlations. What about if we can model these predictors of support? We need to look at indirect relationships. We need to figure out whether that messaging experiment did anything, when we expose people to a strategic message about aquaculture. We're following up this work in the Theme 4 team with a representative survey of Maine residents. So we're going to repeat some of the things that we asked in those national questions, but we're going to make it specific to Maine as well. And part of the reason for that is so that we can feed our results into the other themes work and figure out, how there might be differences in public opinion across Maine, which is important to know. We're following up the national content analysis with a content analysis of Maine newspapers. Interesting part here is that we're looking specifically at some geographic mapping. So how can we look at locations that are mentioned in these articles and actually think about, is the southern part of the state always mentioned more? Is Washington County only mentioned about salmon? So does mention of Washington County drop off, and so forth? And that will also be important to feeding into the rest of the SEANET themes. And finally, it's really imperative to share these results with stakeholders. We're already just about halfway through SEANET, and we've got lots of people that are interested in this work in this state, and we've just begun to be in a place where we can share that with them. So I know in Theme 4 we've worked a little bit with the Maine Aquaculture Association to talk about what we found, but there's a lot of work that can be done moving forward. All right, and with that, I'm going to stop talking, but thank you so much for your attention. Be happy to answer questions.
We've got plenty of time.
Yes, Catherine.
I have a couple questions, and they both kind of have to do with sort of methodology.
Yes.
I think in sort of communication, research. And so the first is, how do you account for, so by only analyzing news media, are you missing, and then even in the trust question about what sources you trust, you're not accounting for environmental, non-governmental organizations who have really started and driven the conversations about aquaculture. They drive the news media, and so how do you account for them by only, or how do you frame the news media if that's the only source?
Correct. We're not getting at the whole story. No, you're right. These are limited ways of understanding source credibility, and we struggled because just to ask people in a sort of, this will take me a while, too many animations. So just to kind of ask this in a way where we can get reliability, you have to ask this series of statements. And so if you do that for, X number of different sources, it becomes so cumbersome to the person answering the survey. So you're absolutely right, and it's not the full picture. And so we struggled, and that's why we ended up with 3, but we know that it's not.
So, in general, how are communications or researchers dealing with the fact that, fewer and fewer people get their information from traditional news sources?
Yep.
They're getting it in their Facebook feed, and
Yep.
they're getting it from their friend.
Yep.
How do you, as a researcher, how are people dealing with that?
Yeah, a number of ways. In the Maine survey, we're going to ask a lot more specific questions about this. In the national one, we didn't have a ton of room, but we're going to do a section of questions, I hope, that asks not just about traditional media, things like newspapers, but social media, new media sources, various websites, even just going to various websites like Sea Grant or Extension, whatever it is. I think that's going to be really critical. And if we had, all the space and time and resources, I would do a whole survey on that because I, as a communication person, I think it's critical because how can you, if you don't know where people are getting their information, then, you're making a huge assumption about where to target things and how to strategize. But working with what we have, but they're good. Yeah.
And then just one more question. And this speaks to, you noticed the sort of tropes of this information getting repeated. And I, definitely in my experience have seen that. And it goes back, farther into the 1990s when those first bad news stories were coming out.
Yep.
And so, the idea of this persistence of some controversy and that, it's like, I'm just wondering if you have recommendations for practitioners about how, it's very hard to correct or overcome messages once they're out there. And so what do you see for signals on how we might be able to refrain?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just talking to a colleague about this, who's doing completely different context, but she's working with journalists on covering piping plover, endangered species conservation, and how journalists have tended to, talk about the piping plover as this, you're messing up this and that construction project, and how do you change that? I think it would be fantastic if we could do some sort of engaged strategies where, journalists and researchers and SEANET folks and Sea Grant folks got together and actually had a sort of workshop about this. I mean, actually having a conversation. My grad student Kevin is actually working on a companion project to the media analysis where he's interviewing journalists in New England and thinking specifically, he's doing a Q-sort study as well. So he's going to be thinking about how their perceptions of aquaculture maybe relate or don't relate to what they're actually writing about in their articles. So that should be really interesting, just to get their take on it, even if they perceive aquaculture as a risky or environmental issue to begin with. So I think some combination of those things will be interesting. I hope we can do it on SEANET. Yeah.
Just kind of building on what you were saying there about the grad student's research and how he's looking at perception compared to the information they're getting. Are you guys going to do any kind of cross-reference between the media content analysis stuff and the online survey?
Yes. So in particular, for the Maine survey, we're going to have a lot more questions on media use, so we can hopefully look at the Maine content analysis results and say sort of like, okay, this person is a really heavy user of Bangor Daily News and Portland Press Herald, and oh, look at that, those two sources between this year and this year tended to really cover risk. So we can make more of those sort of, we can look at some correlations and things like that, but it is a tricky thing to do, and it's always, people always say, pair the public opinion data with news media analysis. How you actually do it is tricky, but we're trying. Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of a two-part question here. I'm sorry if I missed the answers to these. Earlier on, you said that you covered people from all four regions of the United States. Did those include every single state in the U.S.? And was there any positive or negative correlation to the outlook of people in states where aquaculture is a huge industry versus non-existent or smaller states?
That's a really good question. So yes, people in every state were in the survey, but no, it did not look at, and that's a great thing that we can look at, is to kind of think about, creating some kind of variable or some way, some lens to look at, okay, you're in a state like Maine or Washington or Idaho that has, a lot of aquaculture, and are you different in some way? So future analysis, but yeah, it's a really great idea.
And kind of from the standpoint of a consumer, I'm the gal that wants to know where my fish has been farmed or captured, and I'm not buying stuff from China. A question about habitual perceptions that you bring to the grocery store might clarify people who are looking for resonance and a reference point over health outcomes.
Yep, we did ask about that in the survey, and that's a great point. And I didn't have time to talk about it today, but we do ask sort of like when you're in the grocery store, what kinds of things do you think about? Yep, good.
So I didn't want to hog. I was interested in, towards the end, you sort of talked about how what this research could be used for. And I wondered, even in the way that like the university research is kind of trusted more than some other sources in other ways. I wonder, so GFK, that you could, the aquaculture industry could hire market researchers to help them figure out things like this. Might not be as wonderful research as you've done, but that's what they do for a living. And that could then go inform the marketing strategies of the aquaculture industry.
Sure.
What do you guys see, what do SEANET researchers see, and what do you think other people see about? Is it your goal to play the same role in support of the aquaculture industry? Is it a different role? And does that affect other perceptions of the university? How do you think about that?
I think we can play a similar role. I mean, certainly, Maine Aquaculture Association could have done, could have hired GFK it's super expensive.
Oh yeah, sure. I understand that.
So luckily, it's great that we're supported. NSF is covering us to do this kind of thing. I think we provide, or my perspective is we provide a little bit more breadth. We're not just sort of talking about here's what you have to do to sell a product, which, not to say that's all they're interested in, but I think some of these more nuanced issues of trust may not be sort of top of the list. I think they can sometimes be ignored because it's more the emphasis on, how do I frame this message to get support or sell products or whatever it is. But maybe we need to step back and think about the sort of antecedents to that. And I think by employing multiple methods and the fact that we're on this team, we have so many perspectives, we can provide that. I hope that's what we provide. And also, I don't know many firms or trade organizations that can have multiple analyses. So they can't have, an economic analysis and a nationally representative survey and an ethnographic study, but we can provide that. So that's what I would say.
Any other questions? Well, feel free to come up afterwards, but let's thank Laura again for a great talk.